it is. I'm Celeste Fraser. You all know the story here. We've been in business for 10 or so years, and we've gotten the valley up to not pristine. I'm not even supposed to use the word pristine. Sure. And but the forests are healthy. We're really afraid of wildfires, so we take good care of the forests, chop down the disease from the old. And the rivers are in repair. We had all kinds of debris right after the 2013 flood. So we're still in the business. We still get grants. It's one of the ones who writes grants and helps out. Anyway, we're still in business. We've got grants for the next 2 years. So we depend on your donations because these grants, especially now that we're without donations from the truck shop, which is out of business temporarily, I hope. But anyway, the grants call for in-kind donations. So that's where you come in. So that we have to show that we've raised X amount of money, or we have X amount of people who do our work. And that's part of the grant getting business. So thank you all for coming. Tonight we have Jill Barrett. He's going to talk to us about nitrogen. And how in the world do we get nitrogen in our lakes?
Happy to tell you that.
Right.
Thank you, Rich. It's lovely to be invited. There's a long story here. I was supposed to give this talk like a year ago, and either I or someone else forgot to tell me the date, so it came at once. And anyhow, I'm happy to be here tonight, and I'm happy that you invited me. There is a watershed running through my story, and of course, Lochdale Watershed sits in the Big Thompson River Basin, so you can all think of this as a harbinger. Sadly, none of our ecosystems up here are pristine. And I know that because I've taken I've taken lake sediment cores. So I'm back 14,000 years to look at the history of the lakes in Rocky Mountain, of this lake, Skypot, in Rocky Mountain National Park, and the lock. And they stopped being pristine about 160 years. Oh, that one goes out. But they're still very clean. They're about as clean as any place on the planet. And we can protect them if we can, if we know what to do. And so one of the things I'm going to talk to you about today is nitrogen. And I am going to say it really is probably the biggest global change you have never heard of, because you can't see it or feel it, although sometimes you can smell it when it's coming up from that's on feedlots. I'll talk a lot about those today. Yeah. So pay no attention to this green line. We don't know why it's there. So nitrogen is the stuff of life. All right, move. Oh, where did we start? That's true. Nitrogen is the stuff of life. Your DNA is made up of nitrogen. All the protein in your body and in every other living thing's body is mostly nitrogen. So we require nitrogen. Every living thing on the planet requires nitrogen. And during the Green Revolution, which was in the 1960s, 50s, we figured out how to use synthetic nitrogen fertilizer to feed the world. So today, more than 50% of the world's population is fed by crops that have been grown with synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. And in doing so, we have allowed more than 9 billion people to survive, possibly thrive on this planet. We've also reduced the amount of poverty by tremendous amounts and the amount of malnutrition. So nitrogen is truly one of the most life-changing events on planet Earth, and the ability to have it as synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. It's made out of atmospheric nitrogen, which is 80% of the atmosphere. They take it out through a fossil fuel burning process called Haber-Bosch, and it was created during the Green Revolution. So it's a solution to many of the world's problems. Why is it also a problem? Try again. Wire.
So can we X out that up there so we can see the time?
Yeah, can you fax that out, Ashley?
It's not.
I think it's on her line here now. The current volume thing.
Yeah.
Oh, no. Any ideas?
Sick with that.
Screens also.
Now it's advancing.
It's advancing.
And then now it's going to.
Yeah.
So I think what we can get.
Stop.
Yes.
So make sure this was. Is that?
Well, I was gonna hear early, saw this Kirby stuff.
Kind of, I'm sorry for that, some news channel.
Yeah, sorry about that.
And we
So nitrogen feeds the world, but a lot of nitrogen potentially stays where it's supposed to happen. And when it does, you get this unintentional series of cascading problems. So nitrogen oxides, this is Denver, creates smog and haze. When you have nitrogen nitrates falling out of the sky or ammonium, you have a loss of biodiversity. I'll talk a lot about that. When you get too much nitrogen, strong nitrates, strong acid anion, you get acidification of your soils and your surface waters. You could also get eutrophication in dead zones. That's the Gulf of Mexico on the bottom. You've all read about the dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico. It's nitrogen coming down the Mississippi River. And excessive nitrogen creates anoxia through many processes. It's a nitrous oxide is a very potent greenhouse gas. You get climate change. It's also lots of stratospheric ozone when you get nitrous oxide going up in the stratosphere. And not only that, all of these things interact with each other. So nitrogen is very mobile, moves around in the environment, and continues to cause these kinds of cascading problems as it goes. So that nitrogen challenge has come home to roost, and we've been looking at it for a number of years in Rocky Mountain National Park. So in Rocky Mountain National Park, you are here. And we have all kinds of activity here along the Colorado Front Range, lots of industry, lots of urban areas, lots of transportation, lots of agriculture. And you all know that winds prevailingly come from the west in Colorado, and then you get these slow storms. And I'll show you another slide about that. But when you get the upslope storms, it entrains the pollutants from our urban area and agricultural area, moves them up against the prevailing winds, hits the tropospheric boundary layer, which is just about 10,000 feet, and drops its pollutants into Rocky Mountain National Park. So that's the short answer of where this stuff comes from. Over time, we've been looking at nitrogen, and I'll show you why in a little bit. We've been looking at nitrogen to alpine lakes in Montvale watershed. And if you look at the dark black line, that's the total inorganic nitrogen coming in since 1990 up to about 2024. It's about holding steady at 3 or so kilograms of per hectare nitrogen per year. But that total inorganic nitrogen is made up of two subcomponents. One is ammonia, which is the blue line, and the other is nitrate, which is the red line. Nitrate comes out of tailpipes, well, nitrogen oxides comes out of tailpipes of cars, it comes out of industry, power plant generation, and it's going down because of the switch to cleaner fossil fuels, natural gas, and also to more renewables. It's also going down because of the CAFE standards and cleaner tailpipes of cars. On the other hand, if you look at that blue line of ammonium, it's going up at exactly almost opposite, same direction, same magnitude. So ammonium has been going up as nitrate goes down. that overall total nitrogen's been holding the same at about 3 kilograms of nitrate per hectare. So let me put that in perspective. The background deposition, if you go pre-industrial, say 1840, 1850, background nitrogen deposition would have been 0.4 to 0.7 kilograms per hectare per year. So we're an order of magnitude greater than that. The critical low, which is the amount of nitrogen below which you wouldn't see any ecological effect, is 1.5. So we're at 3, we need to drop it by half if we want to restore our ecosystems with respect to nitrogen. So how do we know all this? We measure rain and snow chemistry. We have a weather station and a series of these buckets up in Watershed. You might have stumbled on them in the winter, because very often everybody follows our tracks. These buckets get changed once a week, year in, year out, 52 or 3 weeks out of the year. And we collect rain and snow. It gets sent to a central laboratory in Wisconsin, where all the other 250 sites that collect precipitation out of this National Atmospheric Deposition Program send their samples. So the samples are very high quality. We come up with a national network of what precipitation chemistry is at any given time. And we measure it weekly, which means we do it even in the winter. It's usually a blast to get up there, although many of you know what it can be like in the wintertime. Okay, so the pneumonia that I'm talking about comes from agriculture. It comes from agricultural activities because it's a byproduct of urine, especially, but also manure. So it comes from agriculture, but not this kind of agriculture. This is not your grandparents' farm. What we're talking about instead is agriculture, industrial agriculture, very large scale. We have feedlots. We have actually the largest feedlot probably in the world, just east of Greeley. It's called Five Rivers Cattle Company. They're very proud. They should be. They're a remarkably profitable organization. But we also have many, many other sources of agricultural emissions, mostly from livestock coming in. And livestock like this is fed on a scale of hay and grain like that. And we are the agricultural powerhouse pretty much of the world because of this level of agriculture. Okay, let me bring this back to home and talk about what we are doing. So that yellow dot's Rock Mountain National Park. I'm sorry, it's a little yellow dot. But if you look from between Fort Collins and Denver, all of those pins are dairy farms and feedlots. And a lot of them follow the South Platte River. You can see that. A lot of them are especially abundant in Greeley and in Larimer County and in Weld County, Larimer County, and in Morgan County, Adams County, Morgan County. Weld County alone, it ranks second in the United States for cattle on feed. We have more than 1 million head of cattle in Weld County at any given time, Weld, Larimer, and Morgan. We also have 105 dairies, 42,000 animals there. We're first in lamb feeding in the United States, Weld County alone, and 100,000 hogs, lots of chickens and turkeys. We are an agricultural powerhouse, Weld County especially wealthy, partly for its agriculture. So that's something to be proud of if you're a Coloradan, and if you eat beef, it's something to be proud of. I mentioned this before, the way it gets up to the park, even though the prevailing from the west is in the spring and summer and sometimes in the fall, you get these upslope weather events, the green ones, which can be, or the monsoons, which is the pink stuff, the green ones which come in from the Gulf of Mexico and the Gulf of California, and they sweep up, as I mentioned before, they entrain all those balloons, move them up into the mountains, drop them on Rock Mountain National. So that's an introduction of why we started in Lockville. I started Lockville Watershed as a research activity when I worked for the National Park Service, which I did for 15 years. And it was these objectives we set out in 1983. We have never changed them. They've been as good then as they are now. First is to understand and differentiate what's natural up there from what's unnatural human-caused disturbance. We looked at drivers of change. We looked at both climate change and atmospheric deposition. In the beginning, the whole story was atmospheric deposition, and now it's a combination of climate and atmospheric deposition. We're looking at what happens in high elevation ecosystems, and our major objective is to share this knowledge with resource managers, primarily National Park Service, but also with Forest Service, with any other public lands, or even private land people who care about this kind of activity. We have now actually 44 years in counting of continuous monitoring. We go back in time by using paleolimnology, taking lake sediment cores to reconstruct what happened in the past. We do experiments in the field and in the laboratory because monitoring alone won't tell you cause and effect. You have to do these experiments. So we do what-if scenarios by using models, using process models, and increasingly we're comparing what we see in Rocky Mountain National Park with areas across Colorado, the North America, and all over the Northern Hemisphere. So that's been our modus operandi for many, many years. Yes, please.
When you say experiments to test cause and effect, is that in a lab? You're looking at how many parts from automobiles, how many parts from whatever?
Well, we do it both in the lab and the field. And we don't look at sources, although I'm working with a group of people from Atmospheric Science Department who do that. What we do is we add nitrogen, we add ammonium, we add phosphorus, because that's another essential nutrient, and we look at what happens. So here's a field experiment that we did. Some of you may know Corin Nidek. Anybody here? Corin lives in Estes Park. She was chief of resource stewardship for a number of years in Rocky Mountain National Park. She was my PhD student. So when she was doing her PhD, we actually had to go up to Wyoming to find lakes that were low in nitrate. And we set out what we called mesocosms, which were essentially hula hoops in plastic sheet. And within each of them, we added a different combination of nutrients. And then we monitored how that affected the algae and the zooplankton over time. So those were some of the field experiments we've done. And then we've taken them back to the lab. I have some other pictures. And we do the same thing under different temperatures as well. So we can't say that came from an automobile. Sure. But if we know that it's nitrate, we know it's only 3 or 4 possible sources.
Thank you.
Yep. But please interrupt. Otherwise, I'll just keep barreling on.
Okay.
So here's the punchline. If you want to sleep through the rest of the middle of the time, everywhere we look in Lockvale Watershed, we instrumented Lockvale back in 1983. We put up weather stations, I showed you that, and stream gauges. We put up stream gauges. Everywhere we looked in the ecosystem, we found effects from added nitrogen. So, as what I was telling you before, that nitrogen is this, the Green Revolution made crops grow better. Nitrogen is a fertilizer. You've probably all put it on your lawns and vegetables to make them grow better. So what we're doing right now in Rocky Mountain National Park is fertilizing Rocky Mountain National Park. Should that happen in a national park, which is a clean air class 1 area, where you want to protect it in its most pristine condition? No, you don't want to fertilize Rocky Mountain National Park. So, be that as it may, that's what we have done. So we looked at all the I'm a biogeochemist, ecological stuff happens, but mostly I talk about chemistry. I'll try not to do that tonight. We've had over 2,200 publications, 25 graduate degrees. A lot of our work, all of our work is very credible and has passed tests of credibility. So we started first, this is a colleague of mine from Boulder. I didn't do this work. Bill Coleman and his many students did. We started looking at alpine vegetation. What happens if you fertilize? Now that was another experiment. He took, and I did too, in forest, but he in the alpine down at Niwot Ridge took plots, meter square plots, and he added nitrogen to them over many, many years to say, what happens if you fertilize? Well, what happens if you fertilize is this kind of scenery turns into that kind of scenery. You get sedges and grasses, and the flowering plants are basically shaded out. They don't get that opportunity to grow and flower. And you can see that figures here. So he then repeated some of those experiments up on Trail Ridge, and yes, the same thing happens. So unfortunately, when you fertilize the alpine, because it's a grassland, you get happy grasses and a whole lot less flowering plants. We then went down to the forest, and we did forest biogeochemistry. I set up 3 permanent sets of plots, coarse fertilization plots, where for 20 years we added ammonium nitrates to trees that look like this. Lockvale is old growth spruce fir. Some of these trees are 350 to 700 years old. We found that even when they are that old, you fertilize them, they grow better, and they're happy. So we did a comparison east versus west of the Continental Divide, and we saw very striking, significant, scientifically significant changes when you fertilize. Not only do you change the forest structure, the trees are growing better, but we also found changes in soil chemistry, microbial activity, and food webs. We dropped our soil by a pH, half a pH in it, so it was already acid because it's a coniferous forest. It went even more acid. We changed the fungal and microbial ratios. We did all of these things with very nitrogen, 25 kilograms per nitrogen per hectare per year. And for comparison, I mentioned that we have 3 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. If you go to the Los Angeles basin, they have 80. And if you go to the eastern United States, it's 15 to 20. So we have very low nitrogen deposition, and yet still it's causing these effects because we're so high, we're so exposed, it's granite rock, there's nothing buffer it coming. Okay, we then moved into the lakes and streams. And again, we found all kinds of changes. We saw changes in the nutrient mixture that causes algae to grow. It changed the productivity of these lakes, making them more productive, of course, because it's a fertilizer. We found that we changed the algae that grow on the lake from being surface diatoms that you can't actually see, but if you stepped on a rock, it's slippery, those are diatoms. It changed it from that to this, which is now green algae dominated. And we saw this again, and anecdotally in many other lakes all over the western United States. We also found changes in lake algal assemblages. We found that if you fertilize them, this is corn for here's a control. If you fertilize them with nitrogen, you bump up the productivity. If you add nitrogen and phosphorus together, you really bump up the productivity. Here's some of our laboratory experiments that you were taught. The point is, we're increasing the productivity of our alpine lakes, and we're certainly increasing it all over as we add nitrogen deposition. So we found that all of those things really started about 1950. I mentioned 1850 before as the year. That's when we started to see heavy metals from the rise of mining activity in the state of Colorado. So you could see that in the rise of lead, cadmium, zinc, and copper. But here in our algae, we started to see an increase in productivity. It started about 1950, which is about the same time when all other climate change and global change activities became very prominent all over. And you can see it here, our lakes are getting greener. The green algae is dominating, the diatoms are declining. We're changing these ecosystems with a little bit of nitrogen coming in. And it really is a little bit. So everywhere we looked, we found changes. And this is like 35 years of research. So I'm condensing it into a couple of minutes, but we found changes in the alpine, subalpine soils, in the lakes, in their productivity. It's undeniable that it's happened. So, a lovely picture of Black Reel Watershed. Rocky Mountain National Park, as you know, is protected by the U.S. Clean Air Act from damaging effects of air pollution. Lawsuits were threatened. I do talks like this all the time. And my students did too. And we were giving talks to Natural Resource Defense Fund, Environmental Defense Fund, Trout Unlimited, as well as all kinds of civic groups. And all kinds of people are going, wow, that's a lot of change. That's not just change, that's damage. So back in the year, it'll come. Lawsuits were threatened by Trout Unlimited and NRDC, Natural Resource Defense Council. They said to the Secretary of the Interior, if you don't prevent this pollution from affecting Rocky Mountain National Park, we're going to sue you. And to their great credit, the superintendent of the park at the time, he agreed. He said, this is a problem. Now, Rocky Mountain National Park, no national park is a regulatory agency. So they went ahead and acted. They publicly said, we are damaging Rocky Mountain National Park from air pollution, but we can't do it ourselves. So they developed something called Rocky Mountain National Park Initiative with this long title, Nitrogen Deposition Reduction Contingency Training. And you can Google it. It's got a huge website on CDPHE. And we partnered, the Park Service partnered with EPA, who is a regulatory agency, Region 8, And they partner 8 to 3 years, and with Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. And those are regulatory agencies that said, we will take responsibility for making this happen. We're going to take care of Rocky Mountain National Park. It's groundbreaking. It's been approved at least 3 or 4 times by the Colorado Air Quality Control Commission. Lots of activity, lots of publicity going into it. So part of that was they said, well, what do we want to do? We want to reduce the nitrogen, but how far and what's realistic? So they established what's called the glide path for nitrogen deposition reduction. And I think this is very wise. I'm sorry it's so complicated. What they said, I'm going to ignore these gray lines, ignore this blue line. This is the current amount of deposition on average that we get. That blue straight line is 3 kilograms per hectare per year. These red blocks are the 5-year running average of wet deposition over time since 1990. So they go up and they go down. What they said when we established the nitrogen deposition reduction plans in 2007, and they said every 5 years we're going to establish sort of a pathway by which you need to reduce nitrogen emissions to get down to 1.5, which is the critical load below which there will be no damaging. So milestone 2012 is up here. It was right at 3 kilograms per hectare. You can say, oh, well, maybe deposition is coming down. We were going to do this through voluntary measures because there are no regulations for ammonia. Nitrogen oxide is already beginning to decline due to switching to cleaner fuels away from the fossil fuels. So it was already coming down. So our first milestone, we met that. We were so excited. The next milestone in 2017 is 2.6. We're not there. We're about 2.8, 2.9. And as the glide path continues to go down, deposition does not. It's not changing. So we knew that nitrogen oxides were declining due to the Clean Air Act, due to switching of fossil fuels. And what that did is that exposed the ammonia that was creeping up, and there are no regulations for ammonia. Yeah.
So was that 2021? Looks like there's a huge spike there. Are those spikes due to weather patterns?
Yes, that was a very wet year.
Okay.
So that's why we do a 5-year running average. Otherwise, it's up and down. So much of this rests on how much precipitation you get. So this year, for instance, could be a very clean if we don't get any more precipitation coming. The groups that stop. So when ammonia was exposed as the dominant source of pollution, I had to cut that slide. That was dumb. I'm sorry. What happened was all the agricultural in Fort Collins really said, "Oh, that's us. You know, we are the source of that pollution." And they actually stepped up. And this is the groups that come to what's called the Ag Subcommittee of the Nitrogen Deposition Reduction Contingency Plan. They stepped up in 2007 and they said, we want to be part of the solution. We don't want to be the problem. And I'm really proud of these people. You can see the Colorado Livestock Association, really conservation, cattlemen's groups. They've been coming 4 times a year to our meetings since 2007 to say, how can we be part of the solution? So part of it is they're all Colorado natives. They don't want to be the cause of reducing, a crown jewel of the National Park Service. Part of it is definitely they don't want to. So they want to do these voluntary management practices, and that's what we've been talking about all these years. So what are best management practices? What would success look like if we could actually get them to reduce their ammonia? Well, for me, there's only one real one up here, which is the top one, reducing nitrogen deposition in the park. I just showed you that's not happening. If you're a social scientist, which I'm not, you could claim victory because there is ongoing collaboration. We genuinely like each other. We take them on field trips to Lock Vale. They invite us to barbecues. We're filling in data gaps. A lot of research is being funded by this Ag Alliance that supported financial support into asking questions. Now, some of those questions are finding out what other possible sources could there be to the nitrogen that's falling in Rocky Mountain National Park. We did a study on elk urine in the park. We did a study on tailpipe emissions in the park. we've been able pretty much to refute 97% of the emission inputs. They're not coming from elk, they're not coming from tailpipe emissions, they're not coming from human emissions. So that's the other study I just finished. Looking at the amount of human urine in Black Vale and how much of that is, could that be attributed to the nitrate in the water? Anyhow, they've been tremendously generous. They've also demonstrated implementation of best management practices. And so they are trying to do their part. They have increasing numbers of participating producers. That would be what success would be. And they also have an early warning system that is a weather model that says 3 to 5 days ahead of an upslope event. They text out a message to everyone, 90 of them, that says, upslope event coming, don't do anything silly, don't move your lagoons, your manure piles, don't spread fertilizer, because otherwise it'll get up and come against the prevailing winds to Rocky Mountain National Park. And so for several years, we actually asked them if they followed that. And some of them said yes, some of them said no, but it was a good faith effort to try to do that. That's what success would look like. These best management practices, animal management, they already take care of their animals. They're very concerned about health and welfare. You can fine tune their feed. You can make sure their housing is kept clean, but you can't enclose the animals. You certainly can't enclose a million of them because the ammonia would be toxic to them as well as the people who work there. So these animals are out. You can take care of manure storage, but it takes people to do that and heavy machinery, et cetera, et cetera. They're taking care of these kinds of things. So is it working?
Jill,
Yeah.
who alerts you about the upslopes?
It actually comes out of Texas A&M University. It's a group that works in conjunction with the state climatologist here, Russ Shoemaker, who's part of the Colorado.
I know that, yeah.
The model was developed, actually the model was developed by a student of mine at Colorado State University, but implemented at Texas State.
Okay.
And it's called early warning system. They have a new name for it.
Okay.
So is it working? No, it's not working. I just showed you those slides before. The wet deposition is not declining over time. The ammonium is still going up over time. There are still benefits to this ag group that we meet with, this Ag Alliance, that we have trust and willingness to remain engaged. They volunteer producer-driven activities. Best management practices are improving, but there are not enough people doing it. The early warning system is a band-aid. I mentioned it only works at these upslope events. They don't care about how much pollution is coming if it blows to Kansas. That's fine. So these best practices by themselves are not enough. And what that means is they're, oh, go ahead, John.
When you say there's not enough practitioners, like what percent of the people that produce ammonia
I think it's on the order of 15 to 20%.
take part with you?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
So it's not,
Okay, and do they tend to be the bigger ones? So is it about 15 to 20% of?
there are big ones,
There
but
are,
there's also smaller ones. Some of you may know John Slotsky too.
I know who he is.
Yeah, he had a conventional dairy north of Fort Collins in Wellington. And he was very involved in trying to fine tune the nutrition that went into his cows. And what he was able to do was drop the amount of nitrogen, reduce the amount of nitrogen coming out in their urine by 10%, which is an enormous. But it cost him money because he had to hire veterinarians and nutritionists to work it all out. So it's these guys want to do what they can, but they don't want it to cost them. I can understand that. I don't think that, well, I think a lot of ranchers that I know are living at the margin. They don't have disposable funds to put into this kind of research.
Yeah.
But these bigger ranchers, they could with livestock groups. In any case, that's where we are going. We have lots of science that shows the nitrogen changes outlined in alpine ecosystems. We've had these great actors at the table for many years. There's mutual trust and goodwill, although it might be eroding now because there's really not a whole lot more we can ask them to do. And they are getting tired of us coming to them and saying, still do something. And it's still not protecting Rocky Mountain National Park. So I just finished a manuscript Deposition, where I followed the agricultural food chain through from hay growers and cow calf operations all over the Midwest, especially Western Colorado, through to the feedlot operations, to the meat packers, to the middlemen who take the meat from the meat packers and package them for produce that go to stores, and then to the consumers. And I looked at vulnerability all the way along that food chain to say, well, what is there any way that this activity, these million head of cattle east of the Colorado Front Range could go away? Because this head of cattle, we stop industrial farming east of Rocky National Park. They can move it somewhere else, I suppose. But we have to reduce the number of cattle because there's no other way to reduce the amount of ammonia. And what I found is that this is a system that is tied very tightly together and incredibly resilient to any kind of change. The only thing that might knock it off, it's a multi-billion-dollar business from start to finish each year. The only thing that would happen is if we were to have an entire northern hemisphere drought. So this might be the year where we find out. Otherwise, when you have a dry year in Colorado, it's going to be wet in Iowa, and they'll bring you their hay. If you have a dry year, you reduce the number of cattle, but it'll build back up again when we get a wet year. So it's an incredibly robust industry to get beef from the range into your plate, and all the kinds of things that we've heard about, using plant forward diets, reducing the amount of meat. It's all good. You should do that because it's much better for the environment, for greenhouse gases as well. Oh, I didn't even mention greenhouse gases coming out of the ski lots. Cattle are the source of 30% of all the greenhouse gases on the planet today. So as well as methane. But if you look at where countries are buying, we export a lot of our beef here in Colorado. We export it to developing countries where demand for beef and consumption for beef is increasing as they increase their quality of life. They all want hamburgers. And it's so we're not likely to see a decline in demand for beef unless it becomes prohibitively expensive. I don't know whether that will happen or not. So I realized I didn't give you a whole lot of talking about Rocky Mountain impacts. I could go into detail on any one, but this is what we have done. I retired from the government last year, so I'm now emerita with U.S. Geological Survey. The research continues out of the University of Colorado Boulder, where a former student of mine has picked it back up. And some of you may know Lisa Foster, a well-known person here in town. She collects those precipitation buckets now every Tuesday for us. And she, of course, is a phenomenon. Has never missed a Tuesday. That's when I used to do it. Sometimes the weather was too bad and we couldn't do it. So we get reliable chemistry, we get reliable watershed and ecosystem studies and science, and it's continuing for as long as we hope it will. I'd love it to go at least until 2050. So the kinds of things we've talked to the park about are everything I've described here, but also ways to start protecting the high elevation links from warming, because we're seeing a tremendous increase in summertime temperatures up here, not other seasons. And in those summertime temperatures, if you repair your riparian areas so that you have cooler water coming in, if you allow vegetation to grow that overhangs the streams, it helps keep the water cool, much cooler than if it gets trampled. And over the years that I've been going up to Loch Vale, most of the loch right now has been trampled and spared ground. This is something the park knows very well and needs to try to recover, because it will. These systems are resilient if you give them a chance. I'm going to stop and ask questions, or I can pull up another slideshow. Yes, please.
Where is Colorado the federal government?
Right now.
Yeah.
Colorado remains as steadfast as ever. They believe in environmental protection. They recognize that environmental protections are vital not only for our own personal well-being and souls, but also for an immense recreational industry that's built around public lands, places, for treasured places like national parks. So they're doing everything they can, including our legislators, to try to protect these ecosystems. You know, this is not on their radar every day. Nitrogen is not a big topic. But and I don't know, I think it should be, but I don't know if anybody else agrees. If we were to tackle climate change and tackle that 30% that's coming out of the feedlot industry, we do a lot to protect.
Other regulations handling it. Sure, no.
Yeah, I don't know what EPA is going to do. They're not these days taking the Clean Air Act seriously. But that doesn't matter because we have the state of Colorado standing up and trying to protect us. And right now, so I mentioned that I did nitrogen oxides, which come out of tailpipes and energy industry, are regulated as a clean air criteria pollutant. So nitrogen oxides are actually regulated. They have to occur within certain standards. And they have been. That's one reason nitrogen oxides emissions have been going down all over the United States, Canada, and Western Europe. But ammonia is not regulated at all, partly because there's a very strong agricultural lobby in Washington, D.C., but also because it's extraordinarily difficult. These animals excrete, they're incredibly inefficient. I didn't mention this. 80% of the nitrogen that they consume in their feed and their soy, 80% is excreted right back out the end. So they're only keeping 20% of it. If we could make them more efficient, that would be great. 10% that our colleague John Slusky was saying is excellent. But they're inefficient, and that ammonia is wafting off of these urine patches, these big cement-covered feedlots, and getting up into the atmosphere. There's really no good way to regulate that because, like I said, you can't enclose them. It's damaging, it's dangerous, it's probably death too. So, having faced this, there is a knight in shining armor that seems like it's coming our way. 2 years ago, Jared Polis enacted a new Colorado requirement to reduce the additional nitrogen oxides that are coming out of oil and gas. He said there was a deadline of 2025 to reduce them by 30%. I don't know that we're there yet, but by 50% by 2030. And it's not because he cares about nitrogen coming in, but he does care because nitrogen oxide is the major precursor of ozone. And as you all know, we are out of compliance, Colorado Front Range, for ozone. So it's really, that ozone causes all kinds of respiratory ailments. It damages vegetation at all elevations. It's mostly just human health loss. So ozone is also a criterion to use as long as EPA doesn't change their mind. And so by reducing the nitrogen oxide emissions from oil and gas, we have a chance at cleaning up the deposition in water package. We had not put our attention there for the past, since 2007, we've been staring at the cattle industry, the dairy industry, and saying, you're the problem. But they're only 53%, 54% of the problem. The rest of it is nitrogen oxides. So there is hope here that we could actually reduce our nitrogen emissions and then reduce the nitrogen coming in. I have to say, I haven't seen it in our buckets yet. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about the changes in aquatic life that you've noticed over those 40 years?
I can. So lakes, alpine lakes that are pristine, usually means they're clear, you can see down at the bottom. And it allows benthic diatoms to grow. So diatoms are these unicellular, they're a type of algae, they're diatoms. So they have glass, they're absolutely, cell walls are they protect the organisms. They're made out of silica, which comes out of rocks, especially granite rocks. When these diatoms die, they accumulate in the lake sediments, and you can recover them from the lake sediment pool, and you can identify them to species because these cell walls are specific to the individual diatom that they're living. So we did that. We went back in time and looked at all the diatom assemblages. Those were the dominant algae at the time, going back 14,000 years. And the cleaner the water is, the more likely you're to see lakes that are dominated by these diatoms. Now, I can pull up some pictures there. If you start to fertilize them, they live in low nitrogen waters. Some of them do. If you start to fertilize, you actually stimulate other types of algae, and they start to dominate. And so what we have seen since about 1950, which we got in the wood sediment course, is that we've seen a rise in green algae. Green algae is familiar to all of you if you walk along the creek, you see stuff on one side. It's commonly used pond scum. It's very common. It's the most dominant algae worldwide. And it grows prolifically. And if you feed it nitrogen, phosphorus, it grows even better. So we've seen a switch in our algae from diatoms, which are representative of these very cold, pure waters, to green algae, which like nutrients and incidentally also like warmer waters. So we've started to see an increase of that. It started about 1950. It really accelerated about 2000, which is when our summer temperatures started to increase too. We are also seeing a slight increase, and I hate to say this, in cyanobacteria. These are the bacteria that most types cause harmful algal plumes by producing cyanotoxins. We don't have anywhere near the populations of that in the park, but we have a house over in Steamboat Springs, and all of the reservoirs over there are dominated by cyanobacteria, and they're not getting pollution other than, well, it happens when you warm them up and you give them fertilizers. But right now, the algae that we're seeing, sorry. Well, that shows you the timeline. I want to show you the algae. This is the lock on a typical summer day with that green scum on the bottom. Some of it's an algae called Mintel. It actually forms stalks with leaves, but it's still unicellular. That's what our lakes are changing into, whereas before they were made out of diatoms instead.
And what about fish?
So this does affect the food web, because the fish. So the food web starts with algae, and the algae are eaten by benthic invertebrates, macroinvertebrates, mayflies, stoneflies, things you've all seen. We also have really interesting little fairy shrimp up there. And so those eat the algae, and the fish eat the macroinvertebrates. That's the food web. So there, as we get green algae proliferating, we get far less. They're less nutritious, and they're also harder for certain types of invertebrates to eat because they have stalks and they're growing like this tall off the water bottom. So we're actually changing the types of macroinvertebrates that live in these lakes, which may or may not affect fish. So that's something that we haven't looked at yet. We're just about to start an experiment, which I hope we will, where we've been looking at whether fish in the lock and in Sky Pond are getting squeezed during the winter time because we have warmer waters coming into the lakes, and we have the lakes going anoxic in the winter time. So they lose their oxygen in the bottom waters in the lock and Sky Pond, but fish can't live there. So they move into the waters that have oxygen. There's a meter of ice on top. So are we putting our fish at risk as we warm these ecosystems? That's something we're exploring.
Things. One, if the lakes turn greener, if that's the case, does that mean they're darkening and will absorb more heat? Or does it not make a difference for darkness that the green is for?
No, it probably will. That's an interesting thought. Although the bottoms of these lakes, here you can see a good picture of the bottom where it's kind brown already. It's got a lot of organic matter on it. What's going to really change the albedo is when we have less snow.
Yeah.
So everything will warm.
And then bigger question, if the nitrogen continues to build up, let's say 30, 40 years, is there a kind of tipping point that could occur of something? And what might
more of a trajectory.
Okay.
Well, it depends on what would tip.
Well, I'm wondering what will
Yeah.
continue to happen, if anything new will happen, if it keeps building up.
We years ago would present this kind of work by saying we're at the bottom end of a trajectory of change.
Okay.
And the first thing that would change would be the algae. The second, and the water chemistry. And then the second thing that would change would be you'd start to see changes in your vegetation. And on and on and on until you acidify these ecosystems, which is sort of the end member of all that nitrogen. And if you did that, your fish really would die, like they do like they did in Antarctica. So that could be a tipping point if you're a fisherman. But what we successfully were able to argue to the Park Service and EPA is that it's a trajectory that can be reversed, and we caught it early. So that's what all this effort has been, is to try to protect the system before it gets out of here. Now, we didn't count on having a warming in the summertime, 3 degrees in the air temperature, or winters like this. So all of those things combined are putting us in the hot territory. Yeah.
Have you noticed the difference in magnitude of the nitrogen in Sky Pond versus the lock, since there's a good elevation?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And a lot of what we do is longitudinal studies, where we start at a Taylor Rock Glacier and sample all the way down. And we do that every month in the summer. Sky Pond has the highest nitrate because it's coming pretty much right out of the base and right above it and into the lake. It also has the highest productivity. So that lake is a deep lake. It's about 7 or 8 meters deep. And you have a lot of algae up there that are able to take advantage of that nitrogen. But as you move down the system, you get progressively less and less nitrogen because it's being consumed by algae, it's being decomposed by microorganisms, and it's being sent back up to the atmosphere as N2 gas, which is a good thing, because N2 gas is what we're breathing right now. So it's you can see that progression. The other thing we see, which is going back to your question about the algae, is that we see a real dip in the springtime in silica in the Sky Pond, and that's because the algae are going through a spring bloom. They're going, look at all these nutrients, it's great. So they eat the silica, and we can see that dip, and it's due to algal uptake from diatoms. So go ahead.
And how do you see climate change affecting all this, say in 20, 30 years?
Well, what we've already started to see is a whiplash of extreme events. And you talked about the September 2013 flood. I remember being up there the day after and seeing what it did at those elevations, ripping out trails and debris flows. I mean, you've all lived through it, so you know how that was. I think that those extreme events are going to put us into types of ecological situations we've never seen before.
Yeah.
It's probably going to be devastating to a number of animals that can't survive. I think, I don't know. So I'm a chemist, but I think that that's going to happen. And then we have this increasing summer temperature. Interestingly enough, one of the students that works for one of my forest students just finished a study looking at whether the dates of ice on and ice off have changed in Loch Vale since 1983. And the answer is no, they have not. So the ice still forms in late October, early November. This year's an exception, and the ice is already out. But usually that doesn't happen for another month or so, and it has not changed. But we do see this really warm period in the summer, July especially. So that's going to thaw our glaciers and rock glaciers. We can see that chemically. It's going to cause drier soil. We're going to lose soil moisture. It's going to cause probably more morbidity of trees and organisms in the lakes. It's going to probably cause more evaporation, which will cause concentration of elements. Less flow, less water.
Yeah.
Sorry. We all hoped it wouldn't happen. We all hoped it would happen long after we were dead, but it's happened. There is hope for our nitrogen deposition. We can take care of nitrogen oxide. And maybe some disease will come on. I don't know. I happen to like state, so it's bad spokesperson for this. Anyhow, thank you.
Thank you.